every song must end, and you never do. So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a hallelujah, hallelujah. And I know it's not much, but I've nothing else fit for a king, except for a heart singing hallelujah, hallelujah. I've got one response, I've got just one move, with my arms stretched wide, I will worship you. So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a hallelujah, hallelujah. And I know it's not much, but I've nothing else fit for a king, except for a heart singing hallelujah, hallelujah. Come on, my soul, oh, don't you get shy on me, lift up your song, 'cause you've got a lion inside of those lungs. Get up and praise the Lord. Come on, my soul, oh, don't you get shy on me, lift up your song, 'cause you've got a lion inside of those lungs. Get up and praise the Lord. Come on, my soul, oh, don't you get shy on me, lift up your song, 'cause you've got a lion inside of those lungs. Get up and praise the Lord. So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a hallelujah, hallelujah. And I know it's not much, but I've nothing else fit for a king, except for a heart singing hallelujah, hallelujah.
Good evening, church family. If you could do me a big favor and go into the chat and let me know that you're with us and that we're coming through loud and clear, I'd really appreciate it if you could do us that big favor before we get started with our class tonight. Jonathan Sanford here, coming to you live here on our Waters Road YouTube and Facebook page. If you will, go ahead and share that in your social media channels to let everybody know that we are live, and we will get started in our class in just a few moments. Again, if you could put down in the chat that you are with us, I would really appreciate it. I see Laura Kelly is there with us in the chat. Others, if you could do me that big favor and type in the chat that you're with us, I'd really appreciate it. I see Mary Kate with us as well. So starting to fill up, and I appreciate y'all jumping here with us tonight. Carl and Alice Olson, good to see them with us as well. I see about 10 folks in here so far. We'll give it just another minute or so, and then we're going to get into our class. We got a lot to cover tonight. So we'll get started in just a moment. It was kind of cool having the music at the beginning. Something new I'm trying out here on this setup that I've got here in the studio. All right. Okay, I think we are ready to go for tonight. So let's get started here and make sure my phone is on silent. It was not. So good catch to make sure that my phone was on silent. Well, good evening again. Tonight is lesson number 9 in our study of the intertestamental period. And we have reached what might be called the pinnacle of the Hasmonean Dynasty. And tonight's lesson title, as you see on your screen, is called Power and Price, the Hasmonean Dynasty at its pinnacle. And what we're going to see tonight truly will testify to that matter. It is somewhat of a contradiction of terms, though, I'll be honest with you. During the period that we're going to be studying here tonight, the Hasmonean Kingdom will reach its greatest territorial extent in its history. The armies will move farther, its borders are going to grow wider, and its rulers will possess more regional influence class than anyone could have ever imagined back when the Maccabean revolt first began. But while the kingdom is growing stronger outwardly, I will tell you the dynasty is becoming weaker inwardly. Again, the dynasty is growing stronger outwardly, but growing weaker inwardly. Now, you may hear that and wonder, Jonathan, explain that a little more. Well, yes, we are witnessing here this dynasty grow in terms of the expansion of the kingdom, its land, its borders, the pinnacle of the dynasty's power, but it is not the pinnacle of the dynasty's faithfulness. The kingdom is going to reach its greatest size at the time of the ruling family, but it continues to move further and further away from those convictions. If you remember back a few weeks ago when we first started looking at the birth of this dynasty, those convictions that led to them beginning the Maccabean revolt. That's a long ways off at this point. So, yeah, if you look here on slide number 2, we'll bring that up full screen. You got a kingdom at its peak. Armies are moving further. Borders are growing wider. Influence like never before. But the dynasty is losing sight of those convictions that got them to this point. It's now more about political ambition. There is more religious conflict within the society, cruelty, which is going to just stand out tonight in our time together, and also civil war. So that brings us to slide number 3. Last week, we concluded with a brief reign of Aristobulus, number 1, Aristobulus 1, the son of John Hyrcanus. Okay. Aristobulus ruled for only about 1 year, but that short reign introduced several changes that shaped everything that would follow. The most important political change, class, was that Aristobulus openly took the royal title. Earlier Hasmonean leaders had exercised enormous political and military authority, but Aristobulus placed the very diadem upon the top of his head and presented himself as a king. And that was significant because you think about this, class. The Hasmoneans were a priestly family, but not descendants of David. So by claiming royal authority while also holding on to the priesthood, Aristobulus joined two offices in Israel's history that Scripture, all throughout the Old Testament, that Scripture had ordinarily kept very distinct from one another. His reign also continued the territorial expansion that was begun by his father. Josephus tells us that Aristobulus moved north into Ithria, and he brought a substantial portion of that territory under Jewish control. And as we talked about last week, one of the most shocking moments last week was that he required the male citizens of Ithria to accept circumcision and to also live according to Jewish law. So big changes there for the Ithrians. And that expansion affected the region around and beyond the Galilee River, Galilee, Sea of Galilee. But we should not simply say that Aristobulus conquered all of Galilee in one campaign, because that wouldn't be quite true. I think the broader point is that Hasmonean authority continued to move northward, and the territory governed from Jerusalem was growing. Yet Aristobulus, his political achievements were overshadowed by the darkness inside his own family. He had, if you remember last week, imprisoned his very own mother because she stood between him and complete political authority. And Josephus told us last week that she eventually would die of starvation. I said this last week. I just can't even imagine starving your own mother to death for the sake of trying to gain political power. We know that he also starved several of his brothers while initially treating that one brother, Antigonus, with affection and honor. We know that did not last, but suspicion and palace intrigue eventually poisoned that relationship as well. And Aristobulus was manipulated into ordering the death of that brother Antigonus. Josephus presents Aristobulus's final days as being filled with sickness and grief, and I think a lot of guilt. You know, one of the things that I've kind of figured out as I've studied his life is, at least at the very end, he showed a bit of guilt about what he had done both to his mother and his brothers. But after ruling for only about a year, Aristobulus died, leaving the kingdom without a peaceful or clearly defined transfer of power. So anytime you don't have a clear succession pattern, that is going to create some problems. And we're going to see that a little bit here tonight. So move now to slide number 4. I'll bring it up full screen for you. According to Josephus, Aristobulus' widow, was named Salome, who was also known by her Greek name, Alexandra. Okay. After her husband's death, she released the surviving brothers from prison and would elevate one of them, Alexander Jannaeus, to power. The precise details of Alexandra's earlier family relationships are often debated in history. So I'm not going to speak more specifically than what really and truly I could speak with certainty. But the traditional understanding is that she became Alexander's wife and continued beside him as king. Alexander was another son of John Hyrcanus, but he had not been the obvious heir during his father's lifetime. His older brothers had stood closer to the center of power, received military responsibility, and enjoyed, in comparison, much greater prominence. Yet, here's something very interesting. Through a remarkable sequence of events, including deaths and imprisonments and family upheaval, Alexander Jannaeus is now going to find himself holding the kingship and the high priesthood. The man who had once stood outside the immediate line of power now suddenly is ruling the entire Hasmonean kingdom. His marriage also created a very serious legal tension. If Alexandra was indeed the widow of Aristobulus, Alexander would have then married his deceased brother's wife. Now, you might be asking, Jonathan, why does that matter? Well, Leviticus chapter 21, beginning in verse 13, ending in verse 15, you want to write that down. Leviticus 21, 13 through 15, required that a high priest must marry a virgin and specifically would be prohibited from marrying a widow. So before Alexander ever led an army or expanded a border, his rule had already reflected the, I would say, increasingly complicated nature of the Hasmonean dynasty. He was a priest claiming royal authority, a ruler living within a heavily Hellenized society and political world, and a high priest whose marriage raised questions about his ability to serve under a law that he was supposed to represent. So, pretty complicated situation for him. Alexander would rule from approximately 103 to 76 BC, period of roughly 27 years. His reign would become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most consequential in the entire history of the Hasmonean dynasty. He would fight coastal cities, neighboring kingdoms, Arab rulers, Seleucid claimants, and eventually thousands upon thousands of his very own Jewish subjects. He would suffer humiliating defeats, recover from them, rebuild his armies, and continue to push the borders of the kingdom outward. But by the end of his life, the Hasmonean state would reach its greatest territorial extent. It would become one of the largest Jewish ruled states since the end of the time of the Old Testament monarchy. So this is a big deal. So let's go now to slide number 5 if you're following along. But the cost for this expansion is going to be enormous. Yes, Alexander would enlarge the kingdom, but at the cost of deepening the divisions within the kingdom. And there is this one event that to Jews was very, very special: the Feast of Tabernacles. And that very feast is going to expose just how bitter the conflict between the king and his very own people, just how large of a divide there was. The confrontation occurred again during the Feast of Tabernacles, also, by the way, also many times referred to as the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. It was one of Israel's greatest pilgrimage festivals, drawing Jewish worshipers to Jerusalem from throughout the land. Leviticus chapter 23, if you want to make note to that, Leviticus 23 instructed the people during this feast to live in temporary shelters during the feast as a reminder of how God had cared for Israel during the wilderness wandering years. It was really and truly meant to be a joyful celebration of God's provision and a reminder of the faithfulness of God and God's protection. Now, centuries later, John chapter 7 actually records Jesus attending the very same festival in Jerusalem. So when we study here tonight what is going to happen with Alexander Jannaeus, we are looking at the historical background of a feast that is later going to be very important in the ministry and life of Jesus. Now, By the first century BC, Jerusalem would have been extremely crowded during this festival. We're talking about families traveling very extensive distances, very long distances to come be a part of this worship. The temple courts were going to be filled with sacrifices, prayers, music, palm branches, and the fruit of the citron tree. That is Citron, the citron tree. Now, you may wonder, Jonathan, what is a citron? Well, a citron, you can look this up, you can Google it for yourself, but it's this large citrus fruit, somewhat like an unusually rough and oversized lemon. It was carried together with palm branches during the celebration, and large numbers of worshipers would have held these citron fruit in their hands as they gathered around the temple. Now, Alexander Jannaeus is not just entering this festival setting as a king, he's also entering it as high priest. He would wear the priestly garments during this festival. He would approach the altar and perform the duties that of a high priest that would place him at the very center of the Jews' worship. Now, the combination of those two offices, both being the kingly office and the high priest office, was already controversial. He had military authority as a king, religious authority as the high priest, the control of the treasury, command of the army, and the ability to enforce his will throughout the kingdom. But possessing an office and being trusted in that office class are two very distinctly different things. And Alexander could claim the title of high priest all he wanted, but many people just really didn't take him serious as the high priest. They didn't believe that he was truly worthy to be a high priest. So, why, you may wonder, besides the marriage situation, I will tell you that many Jews saw him to be far too Hellenized to be a proper high priest, too violent, too ambitious, and too willing. Here's a key thing: too willing to rule like the very people that they had revolted against in the very beginning. Remember those Greek kings and who had surrounded Judea. He uses a Greek royal name. He employed foreign mercenaries and spent much of his reign pursuing expansion of the kingdom using military advantage. Now, none of those things were by themselves any proof that Alexander had abandoned every Jewish conviction. I won't say that. The Hasmonean world had become very deeply influenced by this point in time by Greek language and culture long before Alexander Jannaeus was ever in this position. But when all those things together, all those characteristics combined with his claim to be both king and high priest, many people believed, hey, he's crossed a very distinct line. So the family that had once fought against this Hellenistic oppression was now producing a ruler who increasingly every day felt more and more like the very rulers that they had tried earlier to escape from. So, Jewish history tells us that during this festival, there was a very interesting set of events. It tells of Alexander Jannaeus deliberately pouring the festival water at his feet instead of properly performing the water libation ceremony. You see, during the Feast of the Tabernacles, the high priest, he would take that water that was drawn and pour it out beside the altar as part of the worship that day. In that ceremony, the pouring of the water would represent joy. It would represent dependence upon God. and prayer for God's continued provision over the people of Israel. But on this particular occasion, instead of the pouring of the water beside the altar, Alexander Jannaeus poured it around his feet at the altar. And folks, I'll tell you, class, when he did this, the people became enraged. And remember, they were all holding their citrons. Jewish history tradition tells us that they all began throwing at once their citrons at Alexander Jannaeus. And I think that was the people's way of really publicly rejecting Alexander Jannaeus as being their high priest in the temple. And sadly, let me tell you, he could have responded with humility and restraint, but that was not the way Alexander Jannaeus really tended to act. He's going to respond with violence. Let's move on to slide number 6. And let's see how this carries out. Josephus says that Alexander sent his soldiers into the crowd here at the temple, okay, in the midst of this Jewish feast, religious ceremony, and approximately 6,000 Jews were killed here this day. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. These are Jewish worshipers who have come from all over for one of the appointed Jewish feast. They are going to be killed by forces serving a Jewish king who is also claiming to be the high priest. This, if you look throughout the Hasmonean dynasty and all the various historical references regarding this time period, this was the darkest of all ironies of the Hasmonean story. I mean, you look back, this dynasty had begun because Antiochus IV had violated the temple. Remember, he attacked the law and killed Jews who refused to abandon their faith. Remember that? Well, now you have Alexander Jannaeus shedding blood. I mean, the stories that I've read about the blood that spilled in the temple court, I mean, it's just unbelievable to think about. Roughly 6,000 Jews being killed in this occasion. And you don't really know how many of them really threw the citrons at him, but it did not matter. He responded in a very violent way because he had been disrespected by his fellow Jews. Now, if that wasn't enough, it goes on a little bit more. I'll tell you this. So after this moment, Alexander Jannaeus has to kind of figure things out. And what he does, he constructs this wooden barrier around the altar and the inner temple area, the inner court of the temple. He builds this wooden barrier between himself and the people so that they couldn't come close enough to throw anything at him or threaten him anymore. So only those who, had the permission to do their priestly duties were permitted beyond that barrier. There was a great separation at that point between the people and the priest, which, if you look throughout history in these Jewish festivals, that was just not the case until this happens with Alexander Jannaeus. So let's just put it this way. They didn't trust him. He didn't trust them, both ways, right? And just think, class, what that barrier really represented here. Because we know, if you study Jewish history in the Old Testament, the high priest was supposed to stand on behalf of the people before God. He was supposed to serve within Israel's worship and carry out the sacred duties for the spiritual good of the nation, for their forgiveness, right? For their atonement. But Alexander now had to protect himself from the nation while performing said duties. The king and high priest, you might say, is becoming isolated more and more from his people, behind soldiers, behind these hired mercenaries that he was so famous for, barriers and political power. He had the office, but quickly losing the support of the people. He possessed the altar, but did not have the trust of the congregants. So the only way he could command obedience at this point was through fear. And but fear is not the same thing as legitimacy. So just let that sink in for a moment. Now we're going to move on to slide number 7. Um, this incident also helps us, I think, to understand the growing importance of the Pharisees. It's hard for us sometimes as New Testament studiers, and we look at the Pharisees in such a negative light. But at this point in time, the Pharisees were really, for many of the Jews, a very positive experience. I will say you can't say that every person who threw a citron that day was a part of the Pharisaic organization, because Jewish society was far more complicated than that. But I think some of Alexander's strongest critics at this point in time were of the Pharisaic movement. They cared very deeply about the law, this ancestral tradition, ritual purity, and the proper conduct of the religious leaders of that day. Alexander's political support came increasingly from the high society, the aristocrats, the military side of Jewish life. He relied upon that royal authority, the foreign mercenaries and leaders who benefited from the strength of the government, which, I think we know a thing or two about that, right? People who really support the government sometimes are people who are benefited by the government. And that's really what's happening here with Alexander Jannaeus. Really, the only people that truly supported him at this point and trusted him were the people who were in the midst of the government. And so the Pharisaic movement drew much of its influence from the ordinary people who believed the law was very essential to shaping the everyday life of a Jew. So that placed Alexander and many Pharisaic teachers on opposite ends of the spectrum, especially when it came to the most important questions that this nation was facing at this time, like who has the authority to interpret the law? What made a high priest legitimate in the eyes of the people? How much Greek influence is acceptable? And could a man properly hold both royal power as a king and priestly power as a high priest? I guarantee the Pharisaic movement did not agree with him holding both. And I guess one of the biggest questions is how should a Jewish ruler treat the very people who are questioning his authority, which we've seen that play out. And the Feast of the Tabernacles and this incident of throwing the citrons and the murdering of these people really brought this out into the open. What had previously been tension kind of lurking underneath the surface is right now a public confrontation and bloodshed. So things have really changed. Alexander's already shown he has the ability to expand territory. He could conquer cities and rebuild armies and do all those things. But the very thing that he lacked the most was the trust of his people. And so by killing 6,000 people, he may have ended the immediate threat. But man, I got to tell you, he didn't end the opposition. In fact, he deepened it. The people now had more than just theological objections to his rule, I guess you could say. Now they had dead relatives and wounded families and memories, right, of this Jewish bloodshed in the temple court. Like, it's just hard for us to imagine. Um, I will say though that what had happened to this temple did not instantly create like one unified rebellion under one clearly established party. It wasn't really that easy, but it did become one of the events that convinced Alexander's enemies that he was not simply an imperfect ruler. To many of them, he had become a threat to the Jewish life and the moral life of their very nation. So, man, he had a lot of opportunity in front of him to do some great things here with unprecedented strength. But instead, he used the strength to maybe enlarge the borders, but also to enlarge the divide of the people. Let's move on to slide number 8. After a humiliating defeat against a neighboring kingdom. We're going to see tonight his Jewish opponents are going to decide it's time. It's time to remove Alexander Jannaeus. Now, you may wonder, where did this humiliating defeat come from? Well, it came from Alexander's struggle with the Nabateans. It's just this Arab kingdom located south and east of Judea. Their territory included important trade routes, fortified cities, and land that Alexander was hungry for. He wanted to bring this land under Hasmonean control. But the Nabatean king at the time was a man by the name of Obodas the First. Okay? Obodas the First. That's spelled Obodas. Obodas the First. Now, Alexander marched into his territory, guns a-blazing, really. I mean, he felt he was full of confidence. He really thought this is going to be easy. I'm going to expand the kingdom even further. But Obodas, class, Obodas drew him into difficult terrain and inflicted a devastating defeat upon the Hasmonean army. So Josephus, when you study his history about this, he says that Alexander barely escaped with his life, that during this battle, it got so hot and heavy against him, and the defeat was so strong that he barely escaped with his life. And so he returns to Judea weakened, humiliated, and very vulnerable at the very moment that the resentment against him was already at a very high level. His Jewish opponents saw the defeat as their opportunity. So think about it this way. Alexander had already alienated so many people against him at the Feast of the Tabernacles. His questionable claim to the priesthood, along with his reliance on these foreign mercenaries, and his just very ruthless rule against the people, has put him in a position where, with this military defeat, his reputation now is weakened. He looks seriously beatable. The opposition is going to erupt into a civil war. And Josephus tells us this civil war continued for approximately 6 years. So imagine the Jews, who really have just started to get things on the right track before Alexander Jannaeus really comes into power. Now, civil war for 6 years is the name of the game. And this was not one isolated uprising that Alexander Jannaeus could just put to rest quickly. No, it was a very prolonged struggle where you had Jew against Jew, and it was really a battle for what kind of kingdom Israel was going to be in its future. And this is a very tragic turning point in the Hasmonean story. We think about how this revolt really started with the Maccabean family. Now you've got Jewish armies fighting against one another inside the nation. And how much is this going to cost the Jews? Well, we know that approximately 50,000 Jews died during the course of this conflict. Now, I will tell you, ancient figures are sometimes very difficult to verify with modern precision, but Josephus, whether it's 50,000 or more, I think the point that Josephus is trying to make in his recording of this is that the loss of life was enormous. That number does not describe one execution or one afternoon of violence like we had earlier here tonight, talking about the temple court. It represents years, 6 years of battles, raids, sieges, reprisals, executions, shifting loyalties, and families being torn apart by civil war. I mean, you think about it, neighbor fighting against neighbor, right? Family member against family member, even. The land that Alexander Jannaeus had worked so hard to enlarge now being soaked with Jewish blood. And it's an awfully sad situation to study and think about here for the Jews. At some point, though, during the rebellion, Alexander, eventually seeing how bad things had gotten, decides, okay, maybe I'll try to negotiate with my opposition. Now, according to Josephus, he asked them, hey, what can I do? What can I do to satisfy the conflict? I mean, listen, this is bad. We've got to stop this. It's tearing us apart. What can I do to put this to bed? And the answer to that just shows you how bad the hatred against him had become. Their reply was, the only thing that you can do to end this is die. So you think about that. That's how hated Alexander Jannaeus was at this moment. Slide 9. The point is, there's no easy path back to reconciliation after that. Alexander had ruled through fear and violence for so long that his opponents were convinced that there's no such thing as healing as long as he is on the throne. And that doesn't mean that every action that these opponents to Alexander, that every action they took was righteous. I will say that. Civil wars rarely divide themselves neatly between one innocent party and one completely guilty party. Alexander had committed some very terrible acts, but I will tell you, you study this long enough, you find out that his opponents were willing to make some decisions that placed the entire nation at risk. And that desperation would eventually lead to them inviting a foreign king into Judea. They reach out to a man by the name of Demetrius III Eucharis, okay? Demetrius III Eucharis. He is one of the only remaining Seleucid rulers in Syria. And they say, hey, we need you to come help us fight against Alexander. Now, think about how extraordinary that decision is. The Maccabean movement began because the Seleucids tried to suppress Jewish worship, prohibit the law of God, and control Jerusalem. Now, generations of Jewish leaders have fought against that, and now they're appealing to a Seleucid commander to come in and fight against Alexander Jannaeus. And that just shows you how far Alexander Jannaeus had fallen in the eyes of his people, that, hey, we're willing to risk bringing the Seleucids into our territory to try to get rid of Alexander Jannaeus. Also, I want to tell you, be careful when you try to tie up the Pharisaic movement in with this civil war, because I will tell you that not every part of this rebel movement was tied in with the Pharisaic movement. So please keep that in mind. I mean, many of Alexander's opponents were, yes, they were connected with that movement, but the broader was the movement was much broader than just one party. Okay, I'll say that. It included people that were angry with him about his priesthood, about violence, military policies, his taxation of the people. There were so many reasons why people fought against him. The law itself, the Pharisaic movement, was not the entire movement summed up into one. Demetrius is going to enter Judea with a substantial Seleucid army behind him. And they meet Alexander at Shechem. Boy, Shechem comes up so much in these battles. Alexander, he brings with him as well a large force. So you have Jewish soldiers and thousands upon thousands of foreign mercenaries paid through the fund of the Jews. Their own tax is paying for foreign mercenaries to fight against their own people. What a tragic thought. And the presence of those mercenaries, I think, demands our attention, because Alexander had damaged his reputation so much that very few of his own Jews would be willing to fight with him. Many of them stayed out of the battle, but many of them fought against him. very few fought with him, so he had to really rely on paying foreign mercenaries to fight the battles. But if you think about it that way, right? Foreign mercenaries have no family ties. They have no real blood feeling to the battle. So when things turn bad, money's one thing, but your life means something else. They might, tuck tail and run. They had no loyalty. And so this is going to make them useful to Alexander, but also make him look even more like the Hellenistic rulers that had once oppressed Israel. Slide number 10. This is very interesting here. So Demetrius defeats Alexander in this battle near Shechem. Josephus says that Alexander's mercenary forces were defeated heavily. And Alexander was forced to flee into the mountains and hide in the mountains. And for a moment, it really looks like that victory is about to be won. I mean, you've got Alexander fleeing in the mountains, hiding out in the mountains. Many of his mercenaries have, as I said, they have taken off. The money's not good enough for them to stick around. And this foreign king, Eucharis, seems like he and the Seleucid army are capable of winning the battle. But I want you to keep that in mind for just a moment. The situation is going to change in a way that Alexander's enemies had not expected. Josephus says that there were about 6,000 Jews who were fighting alongside the Seleucid forces, about 6,000 Jews that were fighting alongside Demetrius and the Seleucid forces. All of a sudden, these Jews just up and abandoned the Seleucid king and returned to Alexander. So what? History, Josephus tells us that they were moved in reversal to Alexander's fortunes. They saw their own king defeated by the hands of this Seleucid army and king, and him fleeing into the mountains, and something just snapped. Something just changed. I'm not telling you that they just all of a sudden began to approve of him, but I think that there was this concern when I've studied this. I think there was concern of what was going to happen if they did defeat Alexander Jannaeus. Then you have Demetrius and a large army. What's going to happen if they stay behind in Judea, right? So I think, inviting a foreign king into your country is one thing. How do you get that king out of your country once you've overthrown your king? I think that's what really was weighing in the minds of these Jews. And so they swap sides right here in the middle of the battle. And again, I think it's because they realize the danger of exchanging one hated ruler who is a Jew for the restoration of foreign opposition and domination. So they still opposed Alexander, don't get me wrong, but they also remembered the history of their long-time struggle to free themselves from the Seleucid power. So we're not talking about a decision between one ruler we love and one ruler we hate. It was really between two outcomes that they feared. It just so happens they feared one more than the other. Josephus tells us that when Demetrius saw the defections of the Jews, that he just said, okay, I'm done. And he withdrew from Judea. But the civil war was not over. Alexander survived the Seleucid invasion and regained momentum, yet his opponents were not done resisting him. Alexander pursued them relentlessly until many, I would say a majority of the surviving rebels gathered themselves in a fortified position, a place Josephus calls Bethoma, spelled Bethoma, Bethoma. This was one of the final strongholds of their resistance. Alexander besieged that fortress um, and eventually captured it. Many of the remaining leaders of the rebellion fell into Alexander Jannaeus's hands. And sadly, what we're about to see next is another example of just how ruthless he's going to be. So let's turn our attention to slide number 11. What you see on your screen right now is something that, brings to mind a lot to us as Christians, right? What followed this was one of the most horrific events in the history of the Hasmonean dynasty. We know history tells us that Alexander brought approximately 800 prisoners to Jerusalem and ordered them to be crucified. And we need to be very precise in how we describe these men. Josephus calls them Jews and rebels who had opposed Alexander. He does not explicitly say that all 800 were leading Pharisaic officials. But the point is, these are Jews being crucified in Jerusalem at the hands of a Jewish ruler by the hands of Jewish men. We often think about crucifixion as a foreign and humiliating form of execution. I mean, it's designed not only to kill, but to shame the condemned person publicly and terrify everybody who witnessed the crucifixion. And we know that the Romans would later on be infamous for crucifixion, right? I was talking to someone today who said the Romans perfected the art of crucifixion, but they were not the only, nor were they the first people to use crucifixion. Alexander would use crucifixion as a political weapon against his own countrymen. History tells us that while these men were being crucified on these crosses, that Alexander Jannaeus would bring their wives and children to the feet of the cross and would execute the wives and the children while the fathers, the husbands, watched this while they suffered. I mean, just awful. The condemned men are forced to watch the execution of their own families while they died themselves. And to top that off, we know historically that Alexander had a table and was dining publicly with his concubines watching this go down. Man, what an awful, awful time. But these executions were designed to communicate a message to anyone who might ever try to oppose Alexander Jannaeus. He was saying, basically, not only will I defeat you, but I will destroy everything you love. I'll take away everything that you love, and I'll make you a spectacle before our entire nation. Man, this is no longer a ruler trying to restore a nation after a rebellion. This was a calculated terror. Just awful, awful, awful. We know that this type of behavior actually earned Alexander a reputation associated with the brutality of the Thracians. Remember, we talked in the first few weeks of this class about Thracians, right? And how brutal those people were, fierce and savage. Well, Alexander Jannaeus was considered to be as brutal, as ruthless, as horrible as the Thracians were. By the way, there are also reports that approximately 8,000 of Alexander's opponents would flee the nation. They would flee the country during the night. They were so scared of what would happen to them and their families that they fled, and they would remain in exile until Alexander's death because they thought, hey, if we come back, he's going to do the same thing to us. And so, man, Alexander had broken the resistance, but had not healed the nation. He created peace through terror. Awful, awful terror. The kingdom was still standing. The throne is still his, and the rebels are scattered. But thousands upon thousands were dead, terrorized, and countless families were traumatized by this civil war. Slide 12. A document discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls preserves another memory of these events. The commentary on Nahum, also called Pesher Nahum, interprets the prophet Nahum in light of the events that took place during the Hasmonean period. And that scroll actually speaks of a ruler called the Lion of Wrath, who would hang men alive. And it condemns a group called the Seekers After Smooth Things for inviting Demetrius, king of Greece, into the land. And many scholars, of course, say that is Alexander Jannaeus. And then, of course, the seekers of smooth things with the Pharisees. Again, I'm not sure how accurate that is, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, when those were found many years ago, that shed more light on this particular time period. So he has won the Civil War, but it's at such a devastating cost. He's going to remain on the throne, but it's just awful the way things are going. We know that Alexander Jannaeus would continue to campaign for the remainder of his life and eventually bring the kingdom its greatest territorial borders. The kingdom would have, at this point in time, slide 13, its greatest border width, its largest amount of land. Yet the borders he expanded, nor the victories that he's won would ever erase what people thought of him. Alexander, after the Civil War, just went back to work campaigning like nothing had ever happened, really. And yet the people didn't forget. The people didn't forget what he had done. Josephus tells us that Alexander's health had been declining for several years. And really, Josephus connects his decline health-wise to heavy drinking, that he was a very heavy drinker, and had developed a prolonged fever at some point. But even while he was seriously ill, he remained with his army and continued directing these various military campaigns. Around 76 BC, Alexander was besieging a fortress called Ragaba. Again, Ragaba, spelled Ragaba, Ragaba, Ragaba. Even though at this moment, he was not an elderly man by any means, even though he's not an elderly man, all these years of warfare, illness, and physical decline have brought him at this moment during this besiegement close to death. By this point, Alexander, as I said earlier tonight, had ruled for around 27 years. He had inherited this growing Hasmonean state and had increased the borders and increased the size of the army to an extent no one before him had ever seen. But the kingdom that he's leaving behind is very unstable. His opponents were defeated, but they had not disappeared. Thousands had fled into exile, but the wounds that this civil war had created brought a lot of influence against the kingdom itself from within, especially from the Pharisaic. They retained enormous influence among the people. Alexander had spent much of his life trying to suppress that effort. But near the end of his life, he recognized there is no way that my wife is going to be able to govern securely by continuing the same policies that I've had. So before he died, Alexander entrusted his kingdom to his wife, as I mentioned to you earlier tonight, Salome Alexandra. Salome Alexandra. And it was a remarkable decision, especially when you think about the fact that in this day and time of this world, where political and military authority very seldom did it not just pass from one man to another man. Alexandra had lived beside Hasmonean power for decades. We know that. She knew the royal household, the commanders, the priestly families, the foreign threats, and all these various factions that divided the nation. Alexander understood that she possessed the experience and political kind of know how to try to hold this kingdom together. But he also knew that experience alone was not enough. Alexander was going to need the confidence of the people. And that meant she needed to make peace with one group of people, the Pharisees. Let's move on to slide 14. Josephus tells us that Alexander told his wife, "Hey, I want you to conceal my death temporarily, at least until the army completes their siege and secured the military situation." Announcing that the king was dead while the army is off in a foreign field somewhere would have, likely encouraged a quick rebellion or even divided the soldiers afar off, or even invited the Seleucid armies or other neighboring armies to attack. So once the immediate military danger was over, Alexander told Alexandra to approach the Pharisaic leaders. He advised her to place his body and the affairs of the kingdom in their hands and to promise that she would govern with their cooperation. And that advice is surprising when you think about how Alexander had treated these very same people. He fought against them, he had driven many of them to exile, he had executed men that were associated with their opposition in one of the most horrifying spectacles of the age. Yet at the end of his life, here he is acknowledging that the Pharisees possessed what he and his armies had never been able to conquer, and that was the confidence of the Jews, of the people. Alexander could control fortresses and mercenaries and intimidate his enemies, but he could never get the people to trust him. And he could never erase the influence of the teachers of the law throughout the communities of Judea. Now, I'm not saying here, I just want to make this clear. I'm not saying that Alexander had a spiritual change of heart. I really don't think that. I don't think that he came to this spiritual enlightenment. In fact, Josephus actually presents Alexander's counsel as just being purely political advice. He didn't really care about the law that much. He just cared about how his wife could preserve the nation that he had fought so hard to build. Even so, the advice reveals, I think, that Alexander finally understood the end of his life, the limits of force. Violence could silence opposition only for a time, right? It would never bring unity. Alexander Jannaeus died around 76 BC there during the siege of Ragaba. And his reign, as I said, brought the territory into its greatest pinnacle of power, but it also left the Jewish people divided, traumatized, and suspicious of another. Alexander followed his instructions to a T. She kept the news of his death from spreading until after the siege of Rabbah was over. And then she goes before the Pharisees with his body and makes this offer of reconciliation. The Pharisees faced a very important decision. Should they continue to treat the royal family as their enemy? Or do they accept the queen's offer and move from persecution into political influence? See, that's kind of a tough move. They chose cooperation. And in return, they spoke publicly about Alexander's military achievements, like bragging on what he had done militarily speaking, and helped to ensure that the man who had persecuted so many of their supporters that he got an honorable burial. I mean, what a turn of events, right? Uh, just crazy. He gets a dignified burial as a king after everything he's done. Wow. All right, let's move on to slide 15. The country has now passed into the hands of Salome Alexandra. And the tone of the Hasmonean rule is going to change dramatically. Alexander, we know how he governed. How is Alexandra going to govern? Instead of with warfare, intimidation, and bloodshed, she would preserve the kingdom through reconciliation, political balance, military strength, and careful diplomacy. For approximately 9 years, class, Judea, under her leadership, would experience one of the most stable periods in the entire history of the Hasmonean dynasty. But the peace Alexandra created is going to depend heavily upon her ability to hold together forces that still distrusted one another. Okay. She offered the Pharisaic leadership something they had never possessed to this degree before: access to government, the opportunity to influence the religious direction of the nation. In return, their support gave her legitimacy among the people. There was politically important, this was all politically important because Alexandra is going to enter a very difficult position. She's a woman ruling in a world where armies and royal succession and public authority were normally controlled by men. And the surrounding kingdoms might have interpreted the death of her husband as a great opportunity to challenge Judea. So Alexander needed more than just a crown that her husband had left her. She needed the loyalty of the people in a great way. And she needed the cooperation of the priesthood, the confidence of the army, and enough military strength to dissuade any foreign aggression. By the way, Alexandra was the sister of Simon ben Shektah. Simon ben Shektah, one of the leading, this is what's ironic about this. She is the sister of one of the leading Pharisaic teachers of this time period, which kind of gives you a little bit of a hint as to how she was able to make this connection with the Pharisaic movement, because she had a family tie to the Pharisaic movement. And so she was, I think, far more politically experienced than people may have assumed. And because she had spent so many years at the center of the Hasmonean court. You have Aristobulus, right? That very short reign of Aristobulus. And then living beside Alexander Jannaeus for 27 years as he ruled. When she became queen around 76 BC, she wasn't this inexperienced outsider. She became the only woman to rule the Hasmonean state in her own right. She was not the only woman to ever rule over Jewish people. We do know that. You had Athaliah, who had seized control of Judea centuries earlier. But the two women, Athaliah and Alexandra, were very different people. Athaliah gained her power through violence and attempted to destroy the house of David, while Alexandra was remembered as a ruler who brought uh, a nation to a period of relative peace. All right, slide number 16. We're coming to the end here. One of Alexandra's first major decisions was, hey, you know what? My husband had both the kingly royalty and the high priesthood. I cannot have that office together like this anymore. So, yes, she remained the political authority as queen, but she appoints her elder son, Hyrcanus II. So, John, Hyrcanus II to serve as high priest. Okay. Which is interesting when you think about this particular situation. Hyrcanus II was quiet. He was a quiet individual, didn't really have any political ambitions, wasn't interested in political conflict than his younger brother. I'm not saying he had no ambition at all, because he would later on in life become involved in a bitter struggle for power. But right now, it appears that he was less forceful and less militarily aggressive. And that made him a useful high priest during his mother's reigns, because he could carry out the duties of the office without challenging his mother's authority over the kingdom. He accepted this arrangement where his mother was the chief political ruler, unlike Aristobulus I, who imprisoned his own mother, right? Hyrcanus II did not attempt anything of that nature to try to get his mother removed from the throne. Alexandra's younger son, Aristobulus II, though, was worlds different. Josephus describes him as active, bold, and eager for authority, and possessed much more of his father's military temperament. Aristobulus II developed relationships with many of the same aristocratic and military leaders that his father once had relationships with. And these men feared the growing influence of the Pharisees and worried, kind of what's going to happen to them under this Pharisaic agreement with Alexandra. So while Hyrcanus held the high priesthood, Aristobulus began cultivating the people who might one day help him take the crown. He did not openly rebel against his mother at the beginning of her reign, but the foundations for later rebellion are being laid. Alexander's decision, putting her sons in these two positions, gave stability for a moment, but long term did not solve the problem of succession. It separated the offices during her lifetime, while leaving these two brothers with very different personalities and different allies with competing visions for the future, left them at opposite sides, which is going to come into play. Josephus specifically mentions a man by the name of Diogenes. That's spelled Diogenes, Diogenes, who had advised Alexander during the execution of the 800 rebels. His death alarmed the other aristocrats who had served the former king. They came to Alexandra and pleaded for protection. They argued, hey, we had served your husband faithfully, and we should not be killed one by one because our political enemies now have access to the throne, being the Pharisees. Aristobulus II is going to appear with these men and support them. And it's an important moment because it shows him, Aristobulus II, he's the natural leader of these aristocratic, military, and anti-Pharisaic fashion. Slide 17. Alexandra faced a difficult choice here. If she allowed the revenge killings to continue, she could lose the support of most of her experienced military commanders. But if she opposes the Pharisees openly, then she's going to lose that popular support that helped secure her position on the throne. So she responds with a compromise. Alexander assigned many of Alexander's former associates to fortified towns away from Jerusalem where they could live under royal protection and remain useful for the defense of the kingdom. So they're not going to be murdered by the Pharisaic revenge, but they're a long way out. They're in fortified encampments. They're protected. That immediately reduced the threat of violence in the capital, but it created another problem. These fortified towns are now controlled by men who opposed the Pharisees and felt increasingly loyal to Aristobulus II. Alexander's compromise preserved peace for a little while, but as I said, it created these problems. And that just seems to be the pattern we see here in this dynasty over and over again. One decision solves a problem for a moment, but sometimes it creates 2 and 3 problems down the road. I will tell you this. This is interesting. I want to share this about her. Under her leadership, Pharisaic teaching gained such unprecedented public and institutional influence that she planted the seeds for what we would eventually know as the Sanhedrin. I'm not telling you that she formed the Sanhedrin, but I'm telling you that she helped plant the seeds for what we see in the New Testament as the Sanhedrin. I think if you take her out of the picture, I'm not sure that there was a Sanhedrin by the time of the Gospels. Alexandra, at this moment, her reign is relatively peaceful. Judea's neighbors didn't bother her because they admired her. They recognized that her army and fortifications made aggressions, very dangerous. Alexander even sent Aristobulus II with an army toward Damascus during a regional conflict. It didn't accomplish anything really, but it was just her way of kind of flexing the muscle a little bit by protecting their borders. Her reign also faced a considerable threat from Tigranes the Great. Here's a new name coming on the scene, Tigranes the Great, the powerful king of Armenia. Tigranes had conquered Syria and was besieging Ptolemais, bringing his expanding empire dangerously close to Judea. Tigranes was one of the strongest regional rulers, with troops sometimes estimated as many as 200,000 plus. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's some of the figures that were given. But let's just say Alexander knew that Judea could not meet Tigranes and his 200,000 plus in an open battle somewhere because it was going to be a problem. She responded with diplomacy instead of pride. She sent him gifts and ambassadors, trying to get him to deal favorably with the kingdom. Before the threat developed further, Tigranes received word that Roman forces under Lucullus, that's spelled Lucullus, Lucullus, was attacking his territory. So while Tigranes is trying to kind of go after Alexandra, the Romans are kind of coming after him. So that helped Judea escape without any major war. When Tigranes heard that the Romans were coming after him, then he had to turn his attention away. and did not provoke a battle with her kingdom. Slide 18. So when later generations remember Alexandra's reign, um, and remember it as peaceful, I think there is considerable foundation for that memory. Compared with the continuous warfare of her husband, yeah, it was very, very peaceful. But doesn't mean that nothing dangerous happened. Her reign still contained political assassination attempts and rival factions and military deployments and foreign threats and fortified cities. You know, and you got this younger son who's growing. Aristobulus II is growing in his power. Um, Her big thing was that she managed all this without allowing the kingdom to collapse. I got to tell you that the history of Alexander's reign is one of the most idealized retellings of history of any ruler that I can find in all these studies. Like, man, history retells her time period in some crazy ways. Let me give you a few examples. One particular story says that while Alexandra was queen, rain would only fall on Friday night. That it would only rain on Friday nights when it would not interfere with the people's work or the observance of the Sabbath. So you get all your work done. It's going to start raining on Friday night, and then you don't have to worry about the Sabbath, right? An amazing retelling. I'm not telling you that that's true. I'm just telling you that was the way history was retold. Another one says that wheat during her reign, while she was queen, that wheat would grow as large as kidney beans, oats as large as olives, and lentils as large as gold coins. The sages were said to have preserved examples of her crops so that future generations could see the blessings associated with her reign. Uh, Regardless, though, most writers put forth that during her time, the land rested. There was peace. And so there's just a major contrast between her reign and her husband's reign. I think that's the whole point behind it. Slide 19. But, always a but here, right? A but. But when the queen became seriously ill, that balance began to collapse. Aristobulus decided, hey, if there's any time to take power, it's now. I cannot wait until my mother dies before doing it. He really decided that if he waited until his mother died, Hyrcanus and the Pharisees might, make a control grab for power. So Aristobulus II secretly leaves Jerusalem and traveled to those fortified towns that were controlled by the enemies of the Pharisees and the father's former supporters. And one by one, he went to each one of those towns. And in each one of those towns, each group of people, each stronghold would declare allegiance to him. Alexandra hears about this. And again, she's not doing well. Physically, she's not doing well. She tries to put a stop to it, but her time was running out. Hyrcanus II remained the expected successor, and he held the high priesthood, as I've already established. But the problem is Aristobulus II possessed the soldiers, possessed the fortresses, the aristocratic supporters, and the determination to seize the crown. When Alexandra died around 67 BC, she left behind a kingdom that looked as powerful as could be on a map, but was already dividing into camp. Her elder son possessed the recognized succession, as I've said, but her younger son possessed the military strength to challenge it. Her peace lasted for about 9 years, but she could not preserve it beyond her years. The rivalries between these two parties are going to erupt in one more big civil war. And that civil war that we're going to talk about will open the door for Rome to enter Jerusalem and bring Hasmonean independence to an end. When Alexander died around 67 BC, almost 100 years almost exactly 100 years had passed since Mattathias and his sons began the Seleucid oppression, fighting against it. It's just amazing how this has come about. And, when this civil war takes place and the Romans come in, there was shame because the independence that they had won would soon be lost. But there was also hope because many of the people felt like, hey, if God had allowed the nation to rise once before, they thought, man, God can do it again. And they just simply needed the right leader, the right movement and courage to act. And that's why we come back again this week to Jesus, because by the time Jesus entered this world, the people were not merely dreaming about a distant age when Israel had been strong under David and Solomon. No, they're thinking back to a much more recent time that had existed only a few generations earlier. If you never study this, you are thinking that, man, the Jews are just looking for the times of David and Solomon, but they weren't. They were thinking back just a few generations earlier to this point in time, thinking about this small Jewish movement that had turned into this large independent state. So if they could do it, certainly this Jesus could do it. Didn't seem unrealistic to them. So we see some of that expectation in John chapter 6. If you remember, Jesus fed the multitude, right? And the people said, this is indeed the prophet who is come into the world. And John tells us that then they intended to take Jesus by force and make him king. That miraculous meal convinced them that Jesus possessed the power that they, had seen earlier, and yet reminded them of the promised prophet like Moses, right? And so they immediately began imagining what he, in that power, might be able to produce politically. Just very interesting to see how this all comes about and how it plays into the life and times of Jesus. So, as we end tonight's class, again, the kingdom was very large, the army's very strong, and the borders were the most secure they've been in centuries. Neighboring rulers treat Judea as an important regional power, and later Jewish tradition, because I said, remembers Alexander's reign as a period of peace and abundance. So that's it for tonight. We will see next week. We have three more lessons remaining in this class. And we're going to see next week how, now we've seen the dynasty at a pinnacle. Next week, we're going to begin watching its fall. It's going to be sad, but it will lead us to what we see in the Gospels eventually. All right, thank you so much for being with us tonight. For those of you that have stuck around with us this whole time, thank you for being a part of this study. I know we're taking on a lot here each and every week, but I certainly really appreciate you taking the time to join us for these studies. I've got notes if you'd like the notes. I have the slides if you would like the slides. Just let me know if I can do anything for you to help you as we study this together. Thank you again for joining us, and have a very wonderful evening.